doing session 1 of Lunar Fracture, and now we're going to start getting into our 3D modeling programs and our paint programs, and these topics can get very deep. I'm going to do something very light today, and as we move through the project, we'll start doing more and more involved object creation and image manipulation. So, let's look at our objects. Right now we have our guy. Floating in space, and if we press play right now with maximize on play unselected, we should see that he's doing his idle rifle animation and not moving around in the world. He's also, if I hold down the middle mouse wheel and press Alt and hold down the left mouse button, I can see that he's not standing on anything. He's just standing in space, which is fine, but not a very interesting game so far. So let's create some tiles for him to stand on. To do that, we're going to open up Blender. When you first open Blender, you'll see a splash screen. If the splash image is not a picture of a guy holding a hairdryer as a startled pigeon looks on, then you're using some other version of Blender that's not 2.79b. That's fine. You can use whatever version of Blender you want to use. This is the version I'm going to use. Okay. I'm going to click anywhere outside of the splash image to get into Blender proper, and I'm going to maximize my screen. Okay. So when you first hop into a Blender scene, it's going to have a cube with a little weird target thingy and 3 colored arrows and a little dot thingy and a weird pyramid thingy. The dot thingy is a light and the pyramid thingy is a camera, and we don't need them for our purposes today. In fact, we don't need the cube either. So I'm going to press A to deselect everything, and I'm going to press A again to select everything. And notice over here that the camera, the cube, and the lamp are all selected. And making sure that my cursor is in my workspace, I'm going to press delete. When you press delete, it doesn't automatically delete everything. It says, okay, just to check with you to make sure that you meant to delete all this stuff. And we did, so I'm going to press delete. The little crosshairs thing remains because that's your cursor, and cursors in 3D world can get very trippy. So, but right now it's just hanging out at the origin, not doing anything. In fact, I can click anywhere in space and it will just move my cursor if I left click. Okay, so what we want is not a cube. What we want is a plane. We want a flat surface that our character can stand on that will make up the basis of our first tile. To do that, I'm going to come down here to Add, Mesh, Add, Mesh, Plane. So a couple of things. One, it adds it wherever the cursor is, which is not where I want it to be in real life. And two, it's kind of small, which we'll talk about in just a second. Since I don't want it to be up here offset by several meters, I want to set it back at the origin. And there's a couple of ways to do that, but by far the fastest is to click this plus button up here, which will open up the transform menu, and then change the location to 0, tab 0, tab 0. And now it's back at the origin, even though my cursor is still over here, because your cursor is just wherever you last left clicked. It's not an object. It's a reference within the interface of Blender. It is not going to be exported with the object. Okay, so each one of these squares represents 1 unit of distance, and a unit means different things to different people. We want to use unit to mean 1 meter. That is what we're going to use in Unity, and it's what we're going to try to stick to in Blender. So if I look at this square is 2 units by 2 units, so it's 2 meters square. And I could export this, and we could use this as the basis of our tile, except I don't want to because 2 meters square is very small. If you have to create a big space for the player to run around, if you do it 2 meters at a time, you're going to put down hundreds and hundreds of tiles. And we don't want to do that. So what I want to do is I'm going to transform this to make it a big old tile that's 10 meters by 10 meters square. And there's a couple of ways I can do that. The fastest and best way is to go into edit mode and scale it up inside edit mode. Currently I'm in object mode, meaning I can select any object in my scene. Right now I only have one object, so I can only select the plane. I'm going to switch from object mode to edit mode. You can also do this, if you're in object mode, you can also do this with a shortcut by just pressing tab, and it will go into edit mode. It will actually go into the last mode that you were in that was not not object mode. Okay, so now I have a orange glowy view of my object. All of my vertices by default are selected. So let's talk about some basic terminology. First of all, you should be in vertex select. In other words, this image should be darker than either one of these two. And a vertex is a dot that represents a corner or joining of any two edges in a three-dimensional object. An edge is between any two vertices, and a face is a triangle or number of triangles made up of a collection based on edges. So, go back to our vertices. So, points, lines, and planes, just like you learned about in geometry in 8th grade, or 10th grade, whenever you took geometry. Okay, so if you click here, by right-clicking, you can select each vertex individually. You don't want to move them around at this point because we're just going to leave it as a flat square to minimize the amount of three-dimensional editing work we're doing today. But you can select each vertex, and if you wanted to change the shape of it, you can move it up and down. And you can see, if I move it down, it splits the square into two triangles, which is what it's doing anyway. The reality is that your computer is doing geometric manipulations based on triangles, not squares, even though the best modeling practice is to leave everything as squares. And again, to spin around, I'm holding down the mouse wheel and spinning around. That's how I'm changing my view. Let's select A to deselect any vertex we might have selected, and press A again to select everything. And then let's look at our size report up here at the top. It says we've got 4 vertices, which we do, these 4 dots at each corner. We've got 4 edges, this edge, and this edge, and this edge, and this edge. We've got 1 face, which is this square in the middle, but we've got 2 triangles, because internally it's going to take every square and split it straight down the middle into 2 triangles, which is fine. That's just how computers work, and we want to typically try to model everything using squares, and we're going to try and stick to that pattern throughout Lunar Fracture until I need to make a triangle, and then I'll do that and explain why at the time. Okay, so this is still a square that is 2 meters by 2 meters. I want to scale it up to make it 10 meters by 10 meters, and I want to be exact. So instead of trying to drag this vertex, I can select this vertex and try and drag it over, and then I can drag it up. I can try and get real close to the... I don't want to do that. A much easier way to scale everything up exactly, I'm going to press A to deselect any vertex I've got selected, press A again to select the entire thing. I'm going to tap S, which is my scale option, and then I'm just going to press the number 5 on my keyboard and press Enter. That scales it up by a factor of 5, so instead of being 2 by 2, it is now 10 by 10, which is exactly what I want. I'm going to go to File. I can tab out of this to go back to Object Mode. You don't have to, though. You can stay in Edit Mode if you want to export from that mode. I'm going to click File, Export, FBX. I want to export this object as my as a film box model, just like my soldier, except for this is much simpler. And I don't want to be untitled. I'm going to call it Floor Tile 01, and I'm going to export that FBX. Okay. Now let's go into Unity and observe a couple of things about that floor tile. First of all, I can drag it into the scene. I can put it right under my dude. And if I hit play now, again with maximize on play unchecked, he sort of looks like he's standing on it. I can drag it up there. Remember that any changes you make when the game is playing are undone when you stop playing, so it moved it back down. Press play again. And yeah, cool. But that's not really what we want, and that's not really what we're focused on right this second. What I want you to look at instead is over here in the transform. When I dragged the tile into the game, into the scene view, it rotated it negative 90 degrees on the x-axis. Quick side note. It says negative 89.98, and I said negative 90. The reason is because it's trying to rotate it negative 90, but it's using a floating point number system, so it rounds to, it's getting as close to negative 90 as it can, I could explicitly set it to negative 90, but I didn't set it in the first place, which is sort of the problem. For some reason, it rotated my x to negative 90, and I'll explain why in just a second. It also set the scale of my thing to 100 by 100 by 100. But it's not scaled to 100. It's clearly no more than 10 meters. If my guy is 2 meters tall, then this thing should only be 10 meters by 10 meters at most. So what's this 100, 100, 100? The reason that it scales things up is because when things export from Blender into Unity, they are downscaled by a factor of 100. So it scales it back up to make it what you started off with initially. Why does it do that? Well, there's not really a good reason, but they're two different products developed by two different sets of people, and that's just how the cookie crumbles. But Blender and Unity have come together to make it easy for us to have things that have the correct orientation and the correct scaling, which I will demonstrate in just a second. The rotation thing is harder to understand because the reason that it's set that way is if you look in Unity, there's a widget in the upper right-hand corner that shows you you can switch it to looking straight on the x-axis, looking straight on the z-axis, and looking straight down from the y-axis. And if you hold down Alt and left mouse drag to move around in the scene, you can see that the flat directions are x and z, and y appears to be pointing up. But if you remember your Cartesian plane from when you were in school, x and y are typically the flat coordinates, and z is typically the vertical or depth coordinate. And in fact, in Blender, you'll see the red is x, the green is y, and the blue is z. And if I hold down the middle mouse wheel and drag around, you can see that z is pointing up. So in Blender, z points up. In Unity, y points up. Blender and Unity are both aware of this, and so it rotates it by 90 degrees, negative 90 degrees on the x-axis, so that its up direction is correct in Unity because it knows you exported this model from Blender. Let's fix all of this so that doesn't happen anymore. I'm going to delete this tile, come back to Blender. I'm going to do File, Export, FBX. And when you go to export things, you'll notice that there's a bunch of options, and we didn't really look at these because normally you won't set these. But there's a couple you want to check. You want to make sure negative Z is set to forward because that's the forward direction in Unity. Y up, the up direction in Unity is Y. You want to click Apply Scalings from All Local to FBX All. That way, this will fix our scaling problem. Instead of trying to scale things down by 100 and then having Unity scale them back up, it'll just export it at the size it natively is as a film box object. And then finally, we want to click Experimental, Apply Transform. Experimental has exclamation points around it and is warning you that it's experimental. It may not work as expected because it's an open source project and people are conscientious. For Unity, it works perfectly. So we're going to make sure we have that checked every time we export from Blender. FBX All, negative Z forward, Y up, and Experimental Apply Transform. All of those should be selected and highlighted. And if you're going to export into Unity a film box object and you're calling it the same name as an already existing film box object, it marks the title in red to say, are you sure you want to overwrite this thing? And we do. So I'm going to click Export FBX. It doesn't prevent you from doing it. It just warns you by highlighting that row as red. So I'm going to click Export FBX. Now I'm going to come back to Unity. And I'm going to drag my floor tile back into my scene. And you'll see that there's no rotation applied to it, and my scales are all 1, 1, 1. If I put it at 0, 0, 0, it's comfortably underneath my guy. Everything looks dandy. And if I press play now, he's standing on a 10 by 10 tile. The problem is the 10 by 10 tile is pretty boring looking, and we're going to need a lot more of them, and we don't want him just standing on a white square. So I can change the way the square looks by changing his material. Right now it has a no-name material. This is the default material that was exported from Blender with the object. Let's create an explicit material in Unity. A material is the thing that is wrapped around a given game object. For a look at a complex material, let's look at our player. And if I go to the soldier, which is the actual model that's being skinned, and click a down arrow, you can see that I've got a material here that says to give him all of these details that are painted in. Right now it's only gray because we're going to experiment with different colors and different schemes and different details and more modeling. As we move through the project, I wanted to start with a simple base for our space soldier. So let's come back to the tile and let's create a new material just for the floor tile. I'm going to right click, create material, and I'm going to call it floor tile 01 matte. Matte is going to be our extension that we're going to use to indicate a material. So if I click on my floor tile, I can now drag the floor tile matte onto my object. I can either do it in the inspector or in the game or in the scene view. And it will just change the material from no name, which was the material exported from Blender, to floor tile 01 matte. This isn't very interesting. It's still just a white flat square. I can change the color now by changing the albedo color to red or light blue. Our game is going to use light teals, blues, and greens to, along with whites, to maintain a sort of antiseptic space aesthetic until we get into some other zones where things are going to be more colorful. Right now, though, I'm going to leave this as white because all I can do is change the color. I can't give it any kind of a texture. In order to give it a texture, I need to create a texture in GIMP, which is our image manipulation program. Let's do that now. So I'm going to go to GIMP. I want to go to GIMP is the GNU image manipulation program. It's basically a free open source version of Photoshop. It is fully featured. It is the only art program that I use. And I don't really see any need for us to use any art tools outside of Blender and GIMP for the remainder of this project. If we determine that we do need to use one, I'll introduce it later. We're going to learn a lot about Blender and GIMP as we create all of the art for this project. So I want to create a texture. So let me create File, New. And we want this texture to be square because, as it happens, our object is square, and you almost always want textures to be in a square power of 2. So I'm going to create a texture of 1024 by 1024. Make sure pixels is selected. So 1024 by 1024, click OK. And it just creates a square. And as it happens, I had white selected as my background color. And so it filled in the background with white, which is not what I want. In fact, I don't want this background layer at all. The background layer is a special layer that has some weird properties associated with it. So I'm going to create a new layer. To do that, I'm going to click Layer, New Layer. I'm going to name this layer Layer 1. And I want to fill it with transparency. I want to make sure that it's set to the same width and height as my original image. Make sure pixels is selected. I don't want it to be offset at all. And I'm going to click OK. So, again, I don't want this background layer because it's got some funky things associated with it. So I'm going to right click and type Delete Layer. OK. So now I have a layer that has a bunch of gray checkers on it. The gray checkerboard indicates transparency. For this object, we're not going to use transparency, but that's how GIMP says, hey, that's transparent, and there's no actual pixels there. We don't want it to be transparent, though. We want it to be a shade of gray. So let's fill this object with a medium shade of gray. I'm going to left-click on my foreground color, and that will lead me to my color picker. And I can pick some shade of orange or green or whatever. I want to pick a sort of a neutral shade of middle gray. So I'm just going to left-click in my color picker and drag to the left and about the middle of the scale, and that should give me a medium gray. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click my fill bucket, and it's going to fill the whole selection, fill the whole layer. I have nothing selected, so it's going to go all the way to the boundaries of my edge. And make sure, by the way, make sure you have fill whole selection selected here, not fill similar colors, because we're going to do, in order to make things consistent here, we're going to fill things in a very simple, we're going to use the fill tool to add texture to our image, and you'll see. We just want to make sure that we have fill whole selection selected there. So I filled it, and now I have a simple gray. So I'm going to rename my layer here base color. And I'm going to do, and much like Photoshop, GIMP works in layers. So I'm going to create a new layer by doing Layer, New Layer. Okay. And I want to use a slightly darker shade of gray to start creating some borders and some geometric shapes within the texture. So I'm going to click on this exchange because I want to keep my background color as this medium gray. I'm going to left click on my white here, and I'm going to select a slightly darker shade of gray. So I'm going to click down here-ish, and I'm going to click OK. And you can see that this darker shade of gray is contrasted to the background. Now I'm going to do Control A. That will select everything, and you'll see the little ants marching selection indicator around the edge of your object. And then I don't want to fill everything inside the square because it would just overwrite the whole base color. What I really want to do is create a thin border around the edge, around the outside edge. To do that, after I've clicked Control A to select everything, I'm going to click Select, Shrink, and I want to shrink it by 25 pixels. Click OK. Now it's only selecting this inside part, and it's shrunk in by 25 pixels in every direction. But I want to create my border on the outside edge, not the inside. So if I click Fill Now, it would fill in the middle, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that. And I'll hit Control I to invert my selection. And now I can't fill in the center. You'll see I have a little circle with a slash through it saying you can't fill where you're not selected. And I will instead select, come out here and select and fill this edge. Notice too, it's not pointing with the bucket. If you remember a certain version of Paint from our childhood, the tip of the bucket was where you were pointing. GIMP says you point with the crosshairs for every tool. That way you don't have to wonder about which corner of the thing or whatever. So if I'm clicked there, I can left click and it will fill in my selection. And so, let me unselect this. Okay, so now I've got a simple square with a simple edge. I'm going to call this outer edge. So we've got a base color and I've got an outer edge, and they're gray. Neat. So I'm going to do File, Export As. When you export as, it's going to ask you where you want it to go, and obviously I want mine to go in my game dev folder. And it'll ask you what you want to call it, and I want to call it Floor Tile 01 Text. TEX is what we're going to use as shorthand for texture, meaning the albedo texture, the main colors that go onto an object. So Floor Tile 01 Text dot, and this .png is important. That's the graphics format we're going to use for our textures, and you should use that consistently throughout the project. So let's click Export, and it will ask you, hey, there's some PNG options here. Do you want to export them? And or do you want to change them? We don't want to change any of these, just these default settings are fine. You'll want to play with this if you needed to optimize a texture or something, which we don't need to do. It's a simple square, it's fine. Click Export, come back to Unity. Okay, so now if I click on my floor tile object, I have a material, and again, I can change the color if I want to whatever, red. But what I really want to do is give it that texture that we just created. I want to put this texture object into the albedo. So I'm going to drag this texture into the albedo. If you don't see it immediately, you can also click on the radio button. It will give you a list of all the things that are eligible to be textures. So something odd is happening. Notice that we had created a light gray box with a dark gray border, but just what we have in the scene is just the dark gray painted everywhere. The reason for that is because we did not export the UV map from Blender. We just exported the object. We need to give it a UV map and then export the object, and then the map will be set correctly. A UV map is the unwrapped version of your three-dimensional object. It says, here's how you apply a texture to this object. Since there is no UV map associated with this object, and I can show you that by tapping into edit mode and switching from the default view here to UV editing. Notice that there's nothing over here because there is no UV. We've created no UV map. So what is a UV map? U and V refer to a new coordinate system. U runs along the bottom, V runs along the side. U is horizontal, V is vertical. The reason we use the letters U and V instead of what we normally think of as X and Y in the normal Cartesian plane is because in 3D world over here, we're using X and Y already. And it would just get confusing if the UV map was called the XY map and it was also using X and Y coordinates, because it would be, well, how do I put the Z coordinate in there? The UV map is the two-dimensional representation of the texture of a three-dimensional object. We will get into UV maps more when we do more complicated objects than this. Right now, it just doesn't have a UV map at all, and we just need to give it one. It's a square that's not complicated to unwrap. So I'm going to click U while my cursor is in my user perspective window in the UV editing layout. I'm going to click U while my cursor is over here. Click unwrap, and it takes the square and maps it out to a square. So I'm going to do File now. I don't have to do anything else. Export, FBX. Make sure that I have FBX all and my experimental and my -Z forward and Y up. And I want to overwrite my floor tile. Click Export FBX. Click back over to Unity, and now my texture is applied correctly. You also see that the texture is a little bit shiny, and that's because if you look at the texture, it says the smoothness is set to 0.5. That's just by default. You can turn it way up to make it super shiny, or you can turn it way down to make it not shiny at all. We want it to be a little bit shiny, so I'm going to set it at 0.75. In this particular angle, I'm looking directly in a way that causes the sunlight to be completely directed back into the camera, so that's why it looks so washed out. But you can rotate it to see that it's shiny. And again, if something is super shiny, it reflects things in a it reflects light in a tight way. But we want it to be a little more diffuse than that, so 0.75. Okay. Also, what light is it reflecting? It's reflecting this directional light, which is included in the game by default. The directional light represents the sun, and it's just a pale yellow color. We're not going to mess with the directional light today, but when we start talking about lighting, we're definitely going to play with it. Okay, so let's go back to Blender. Sorry, let's go back to GIMP, because we want to make this texture a little more interesting. And we want to start adding some more interesting shapes in here. And I'm going to do this in the simplest possible way. I'm going to do Layer, New Layer, and I'm going to call it Layer 2. And I'm going to grab my selection tool, which is this box select here. And I'm going to start my selection inside my dark edge and drag it, just hold down the left mouse button and drag down to the other dark edge. It doesn't have to go all the way to the edge, just as long as it's inside the edge and not outside the borders of our image. And then, I remember that I made my edge 25 units wide. I did that intentionally because I want all of my little details here to be 50 units wide, so that if I put two of these together, it won't create an obvious square. You'll still see the square, but anyway, bear with me. In order to make my selections here 50 units wide, I'm just going to change the size here to 50. And then I'm going to click my fill tool, and it's going to fill in, and again, make sure you have fill whole selection selected, and I'm going to fill in this. Okay, if I unselect that, I'm going to switch back to my rectangular select tool, left click anywhere outside, and it's going to unselect. And I have a nice thick border there. I'm going to create another one here, and since this one's going horizontal, instead of changing the size of the on the left-hand unit, I'm going to change the right unit to 50, and I'm going to fill that again. And I'm going to do this a couple more times, just kind of randomly making shapes and making sure that they're always 50 wide if they are vertical, and if they are horizontal, that they're 50 high. So I'm going to do another select. Another way you can do this, instead of having to select over and over and clicking back and forth between the selection tool and the fill tool, and there's no rhyme or reason to this. Just do randomly whatever you want to do. You can follow along trying to copy what I'm doing, but I'm just creating shapes. We're just trying to break up the square so that it's a little more interesting looking. What you can do is click on your select tool, left click and drag, change the width to 50, and then if I want to do, say, another horizontal one, I can hold down the shift key and start dragging, and it will just add it in, and I can change the width of this vertically to 50. Now if I click fill, it will fill in my whole selection, and you can do a bunch of them at once like that. I'm kind of okay with that. That's all right. So we're going to leave this as our. Well, let's create one. Let's do one more. I want to make sure that everything is blocked off to the degree that it can be. No, you know what? Actually, I'm going to leave it like this. I like that. Oh, it's kind of interesting. Let's do this though. Let's go here and make this 50. And I'm gonna fill this here, and whatever. So that's just I don't like that at all. Never mind. Okay, so we're gonna leave it like this, and we want to export this image. So I'm gonna do cross lines, just so I can remember what's in this layer. I can turn off my layers by clicking on these eyeballs, and you'll see that I can go back down to my base layer, or I can turn off all of them, and I just have an empty square. And I'm going to do File. And since I want to overwrite my existing PNG, I can just click Export Floor Tile.txt. And now I have a more interesting looking tile. It is a little flat looking though, so let's give it some more interesting properties. So I'm going to do Layer, New from Visible, and we're going to create the Metal map. So I'm going to rename this layer Metal. You don't have to do this as a separate layer. It's just easier. So I'm going to do Colors, and I'm going to do Invert. And that's going to switch my darker colors to be lighter and my lighter colors to be darker. And I'm going to do File, Export as Floor01 MET. This represents the metallicness of an object. In Unity, if your metallic map is brightly colored, you're more metallic than darker colors. So if I click on my floor tile, you see that I've got a metallic thing here. I'm going to drag this metallic texture in to my metallic map. And now, when I look at my, I'm holding down the Alt button and the left mouse key, the two different surfaces react to the light a little bit differently, and that gives me sort of an illusion of depth. Let's do something over here. Let's come back here, and I'm back in GIMP, and go to Colors, Brightness and Contrast. Let's turn the brightness way up, and take the contrast to its logical conclusion. Actually, let's turn the brightness down. There we go. So we end up with bright whites and dark blacks instead of our grays. Okay? And then let's overwrite our metallic texture in Unity. Now we can see that that difference is much more defined. So if we take our smoothness and set it back to 0.75 where it's supposed to be, the two different areas react a little bit differently to the light and starts to give us the feeling that there's a texture applied to the surface. So let's do one more thing here. Let's go to Filters, Generic, Normal Map. And this is going to allow us to fake some three-dimensionality within a flat texture. This looks good, so I'm going to do OK, File, Export as, and I'm going to rename this NOR. NOR is the shorthand we're going to use for our normal map. And these are the three textures we're going to create for every object. We're going to create a texture, a metallic, and a normal map. A normal map uses colors in the map to fake three-dimensionality. And you can see it sort of looks like it's a three-dimensional image, even though we know it isn't. So I'm going to click over here, and I can take my normal map, and I can, with my floor tile selected, I can left click on my normal map, hold it down, and drag it into the normal map slot of my material. It says, hey, this texture is not marked as a normal map. Fix now. And the reason for that is I didn't change this texture type to normal map. I just left it as default when I drug it in. So you can click Fix Now, and it will change it for you. So now it's a normal map. And now if we look around, now it's much clearer that we have added some texture into the world. It sort of looks like we have the dark areas are sort of gutters and the brighter areas are tiles, which is exactly what we're going for. So let's grab our floor tile here and hit Control D to duplicate it in the scene. And I can drag it out, but I want these things to be lined up exactly with each other. So I'm going to, instead of trying to guess, I'm just going to set the Z value here to 10 exactly. Remember that we made it 10 meters by 10 meters, and this one, the first one is sitting at 0, 0, 0. So if it's offset by 10 meters, it's exactly at the edge. Another way you can get objects to line up if you have, if you would like to do it manually, is when you have an object selected, like I have floor tile 011 selected. This parentheses 1 is how Unity renumbers things instead of incrementing to 02. It's a criticism that's been made a lot in the community, but this game engine is so good at so many things, I will deal with renaming my game objects. Anyway, if I want things to line up exactly, I can hold down V when I have an object selected, and it will pop to the nearest vertex. Remember that we have the 4 vertices, one at each corner of the square. And then I can drag, and it will snap to the nearest vertex it can find in the game, which is the other corner of my original tile. So I can come back here, and I hit Control D again. So I've selected my first one, hit Control D, and I can drag it out, hold down V, and snap it to the other corner. Or I can just manually set the Z to be -10. Now I'm going to select all 3 of these I'm going to left-click the first one, hold down Shift, left-click the middle one, left-click the top one, hit Control D, and it's going to copy all 3 of them. And I'm going to hold down Alt and my left mouse button and drag this in the X direction. I can snap everything using the vertices, or I can change the X value to be 10 exactly. And then I can grab all 3 of these again by selecting them in my scene, or I can just grab them in my hierarchy by clicking on the first one, holding down Shift, and clicking on the third one. Hit Control D, and it will copy them again. And I'm going to move this out here and set this to -10. So now we have the beginnings of our floor. You can tell that the pattern is repeated over and over, and one way we can play with that is we can grab this object and hold down Control and 5 and 8, and we want to rotate these 90 degrees. That was bad. I happen to pick things that aren't random. Let's undo that, and instead of grabbing 2 and 5 and 8, let's grab 2, 2 and 4, 2, hold on Control and hit 4, and left click and hit 8, and rotate these 90 degrees. And we can grab some other ones here, and I'm just going to hold on Control as I select these objects in the game, and I'm going to rotate them -90, and I'm going to grab anywhere where there's a couple that look like they're exactly the same, and I'm going to select this to be 180. There. Now I've got some interesting looking tiles, and while we know that they are squares, and if you look you can see that they're squares, it does make it feel like there's a variety of tiling sizes around. It just makes the floor look a little more interesting. Okay, so that is, we've created our first 3-dimensional object. Admittedly, it's just a flat tile, but we need flat tiles for this game, so it's not a wasted effort. We've brought them into our scene. We've made sure that the scaling and rotation is correct from Blender. We textured the object, created a metallic map and normal map in GIMP, and we're ready to now move on to making our player run around on this map, and that will have to be in our next video. So we'll pick up there next time. One more thing I wanted to show before we end today is that if you make any changes to the material, it changes the material universally. So even though I only have floor tile 01 parentheses 2, this tile right here, selected, if I change its color from white to, let's say, a light blue, it changes the material in the project, so it changes it for everything that has that material. If you want to change the material for just one object, what you need to do is create a new material. So I'm going to hit select my material, hit Control D, drag that material onto the game object that you want to change, and then you can change it independent of the others. But we don't want to do that right now. Let's just stick with one floor tile material. delete this. Okay. And I'm actually going to change this to being, I like the sort of the blue-green color, and we're going to use that extensively, like I said, at the project at this point. Anyway, another way, if you want to look at the shininess without having to rotate to capture the directional light, is you can actually put lights in the game by doing game object, light, point light, and you can drag those around physically, and you can see how they are affecting the game objects. So I can take the range of this and make it 100, and I can change the 100. I can change the intensity to be 5, and I can get a better sense of how my lights are going to interact with my surface without having to worry about the rotating to capture the directional light. Okay, so we'll pick up there next time. Let me get rid of this point light because I don't actually need it. And we'll get into changing our animator to allow our player to move around, and we'll start writing our first code to actually allow the player to click on the map and move around. I will see you next time.